Phil, when you became like this amateur paleontologist, you became obsessed with dinosaurs and having seen, I think is it right that you saw Rudolf Salinger's mural?
Well, and I saw him in Life magazine. Did a
You're
huge,
right, yeah.
yeah, and I didn't see him at the museum until much later.
Right. But when you became sort of obsessed with that, I mean, I was obsessed with that same image myself. We had a book, like a zoology book or something, and there was a page on the age of the reptiles. And I became obsessed with dinosaurs for a little while, trying to draw them from that picture. And did your parents show any concern that you become very focused on this one thing?
No, they encouraged it, and once it bloomed more into monsters, that gave them pause. I think my mom wanted me to see a therapist. My dad, who was an artist, and that ain't gonna happen. So.
Was it the monster movies then, and the Monsters of Movie Land magazine and stuff like that?
Exactly. Yeah. The famous Monsters of Filmland was forbidden.
Of Filmland.
So I had to hide them and even bury them in my backyard and go dig them up once. It was, a very oppressive regime.
Really that bad that it was banned? You were forbidden to look at them.
Why aren't you going out and playing football like all the other kids?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I don't do that.
And when you were doing that, like when you were into those movies, like you mentioned, like the Sinbad movie and King Kong was the kind of spark that kind of lit this, this amazing career you've had. Did you have any sense that the people around you didn't understand that interest and that obsession? Was anybody at school that was with you interested in that kind of stuff?
Absolutely none. No, it was just the only person. I was growing up in San Diego at the time. The only other person that I met in San Diego County was Greg Bear, the science fiction author, who went on science fiction author, and we were the only two guys that were into that stuff. And then I would have to get my parents to drive me over to his house, or vice versa. So that was the state of things. We went to the very first Comic-Con as well in San Diego.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And there was
what year would that have been then?
67, 8, 9.
Yeah, right.
At the El Cortez Hotel. And as I recall, it was like one ballroom full of a bunch of boxes, like with comic books. And that was cardboard boxes. That was about it.
Pretty sparse then. Were there guests there? Were like there people that you recognize from the magazines that you've been looking at?
I don't remember. I don't think so. But they had other books and paraphernalia you could pick up. I picked up a couple of really good, rare Zebnik Burian books on dinosaurs.
Oh, really? Have you still got them?
Yeah, I do. They're great paintings. They're some of the best illustrations of prehistoric life.
Mm. Yeah, because you've mentioned before you're a bit of a hoarder as well. Like you think maybe I'll need this later, or whether it's a creature you found in a thrift store or something, or a piece of something you might need for maybe Mad God in 40 years' time. You never know. And you've still got a lot of that stuff. You still keep back a lot of your kind of collection, your archive.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm starting on another movie, a stop motion thing, so I've got a lot of Mad God, props that I'll recycle a number of them.
Yeah, as well as those movies you've talked about before, like the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and stuff. Were you kind of aware of any other animation? I mean, here in the UK, I'm 47, and here in the UK, when I was about 6, 7, 8, at that sort of age where this stuff sticks, right? There were shows on BBC Two here that would just like showcase Polish or Czechoslovakian animation. It could be charcoal, it could be pencil, it could be cell, it could be stop motion, and there wasn't generally a narrative thing. It was a kind of experimental thing. Were you kind of subject to some of that when you were a kid? Did you see that kind of stuff?
No, I was, I couldn't even raise horror movies on my, back then, nothing was available at all. I mean, even if you wanted to see Frankenstein, forget it. I mean, we had three channels, and one of them didn't come in well and didn't have access to Los Angeles. So I mean, it was very few and far between. I mean, it was like 10 years from the time I saw Seventh Voyage of Sinbad theatrically to the time it came on television, and that was something I've talked to Dennis Muren about quite a bit, musing that I think that distance and the lack of immediacy and being able to access like you can do today with everything immediately really kind of shaped us and formed us in that we kind of had to use our imaginations to like recreate these things in our own mind. And that went a long way to like, helping us build, not just satiate on things, that are immediately available, but to use our own minds to imagine other things.
Yeah, that's so important, isn't it? I mean, I've got three girls, and I resisted getting any device in front of them for as long as I could and I still to this day do not let them have them in the car. If you're in the car and we're on a 5-hour journey, you're looking out the window and you're listening to the music that we're listening to, and we choose the music between us. I'm not going to have you locked into this world with your headphones on. And that really, it's really important because, I've spoken to Dennis and I've spoken to Ken, and they both said that same thing, that their imagination was kind of sparked. And then there was this kind of this waiting game. Like Ken was talking about some of the films he made, and he'd have to send them off to the pharmacy or whatever to be developed. And it might be 2 or 3 weeks before you get it back. And I think that kind of stuff is all missing now, isn't it? It's almost like, with your work, I always imagine there's a meditative kind of aspect to it. Maybe that would have started off by having that disconnect between you and the next guy in town who's into the stuff you're in, that you weren't able to see every day or every week or every month. So you're kind of sitting there and ruminating on this stuff and thinking about it and, developing your own ideas. Do you still kind of find the work that you do meditative in that way?
Well, definitely. I mean, you talk to like a lot of artists, and I mean, that's the milieu that they live in is tend to be obsessive and into themselves, and when you're focused on doing something, you shut the world out, and so that's I mean, in that respect, it's therapy, meditation, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. A lot of sports. I work in TV. I do a lot of live sporting events and things. A lot of sports people that I've spoken to or heard from over the years talk about that kind of flow state you get into, whether it's like a Formula One driver who's going around a circuit and is sort of elevated from the mechanics of it and is just in this kind of state where they're feeling their way through it. Because I can't ever, I've felt that state myself in my work that I do as a live editor and director. And you come off a show and you think, how did I even do that? You're not even thinking about the mechanics. But for me, there's a leap to what you do. How do you plan out using 24 frames a second? How do you plan out that motion? Do you practice? Is it something you can do over and over again, which of course is going to take a huge amount of time? And if you get it wrong, you've got to start again anyway. Is it just something you develop that muscle over years and years, or was there something always in you that you were able to kind of understand movement?
Well, we call the place you were talking about the zone, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my learning curve was, like Dennis and Ken's, we didn't have access to the kind of playback material you had. You had to, weeks to see your stuff, which is the equivalent of like playing the piano and not hearing any sound, and then hearing it 2 weeks later and trying to reconstruct it. Yeah. So that was just precipitous, and it was just practice and practice and practice, graduating from 8mm to 16 to 35, and even as far as when we started working on Empire Strikes Back, I didn't feel that my skill level was where it needed to be. It was like talented, but my talent had not grown into like the level of skill that I needed to do for that project. At least I felt that way. And so, fortunately, um, production time then was slower than it is today. And
Mm.
while I was building the Tauntaun, I would sneak away, and John Berg and Tom Santamon built a prototype walker, and I built a prototype Tauntaun, and so I would practice with those things, and it was just like I'd go in for 8 hours a day, or 6 hours a day, or 2 hours, whenever I could grab time, and
Mm.
just practice. It took a while for us to figure out what the footfall patterns were for the walkers, uh, and
Yeah, because you
trying to.
looked at things like elephants and stuff, didn't you, initially? But that didn't kind of work out.
Yeah, no, we had to, because of the scale of things. Ultimately, we determined that they had to, have 3 feet, planted on the ground all the time.
Mm.
Otherwise, they didn't have any sense of weight. And then with the tauntaun, it was the same thing. Just crossing that line where the thing is lifelike, and it's like riding a bicycle. It's just like you do it, you do it, you do it, you do it, and then one day, bang! It's like, wow, that worked. How did I do that?
Yeah.
But to me, back in the day, I would, make tons of notes, almost like a phone book full of notes about what I wanted to do. And that was like my, as you were mentioning regarding sports, one of the activities, even as a kid, that, I, pre-visualized, myself doing this stuff in some kind of distant, future, which was at that time really improbable. So, but I did see it, and aspired to do that. I think all that's when you're living and breathing that stuff, it's kind of I think what's required.
Yeah. That shot you did on Empire where it's like the POV of the snow speeder going through the legs of the walker and then over the top of the other walker. I don't know, it's like 2.5, 3 seconds or something. That shot, pretty complex. And I think from watching Light and Magic, I saw that you said that you did a lot of both of the walkers yourself, because I think John Berg was ill or so had the flu or something. With that shot, is that a one chance go at that, or did you have multiple attempts, or did you build up using, some hand-drawn animation first to kind of plan it out? Where does that kind of begin and end?
Well, I mean, the thing that motivated me doing it alone was we had to move off the stage immediately. So we just had to, John was sick and we didn't know how long he'd be out. I just had to do it. But planning, by that time, we'd pretty much figured out how the walkers were going to walk. So it was just a matter of doing it. And as I've gotten older, I don't plan at all. I pretty much, improvise as I'm, going along. And if I have a, idea about what the shot is, and I get a idea in the, middle or wherever, I'll change direction. Animation is like acting. If you feel something else, you can like tweak it another direction.
Yeah.
And so it's really intuitive, for me. And, so I actually don't think that much. I just kind of, get into it. I animate a lot faster than a lot of stop motion guys. And it's technically not as clean, but I find that just attacking the thing gives it a different character and an immediacy that I like better, even though it's may not be as super smooth as some people can do.
Mm. And I guess, like you said, if you feel like there's a sudden route you want to go down, like you feel a bit of the character might do this or do that, you're the director as well, so you can move the camera, as opposed to an actor who's kind of stuck with the operator in their face, or the director calling the shots, and they want them to fit into their kind of boundaries. How much freedom did you feel like you had on those kind of early movies with the directors? Because obviously you got like Empire Strikes Back is beautiful to look at. It's Peter Suschitzky's, the DOP, his photography is amazing. how much freedom did you find within those kind of boundaries, or were those boundaries quite tight?
No, it's just complete freedom. I mean, George would come by, for like the various stages and the stop motion stage, and we'd ask him questions, and he'd say, "I don't know. I'm the director. I don't know what you do." So here's the storyboard. Here's the shot. And I'd work with them quite a bit in laying out like the shot in Jedi, where the logs roll down the hill and the walker slips on them.
Yeah.
Just to make sure, because I knew that shot was going to take a long time to execute. I just wanted to make sure that, okay, so we'd pantomime it out. I'd sit there and act like a, clown going, it does this and it does that and it does that. But you're locked into a background, so there's not a lot of options that you got. So you just play with, what is available.
I always get the sense, though, that George gave you as a group that kind of freedom. Like, he trusted your skills, even though they might have been an unknown quantity in the early days. I mean, you joined on Star Wars quite late, didn't you, with the chess set, the chess pieces and everything. But, when I've spoken to Ken and, I've spoken to Nilo Rodis as well, and they've all kind of suggested that George just kind of trusted, that he employed people almost like on a personality type as much as anything. Obviously, they came with skills, like Nilo was industrial designer from the motor industry. But then he kind of allowed you to find the boundaries in your creative space. Was that something that was really kind of evident and important to you at the time?
Well, we weren't that far off in age, really. I mean, whatever it is, somewhere between 7 and like 10 years. Yeah, and so we grew up on all the same movies, and shared the same language. And so that was, I mean, and you do with most directors, are very, film art historically educated. So, that's always, that's really essential. But, George would Nilo told a story of like, they were working on some shot, and George came in and was looking at it and asked Nilo if he could look through the camera, and Nilo was kind of taken aback. It's like, wait a minute, you're the boss, you're running all this stuff, and you were asking me. So he was very, polite, like extra polite. I didn't want to bump anything or get in the way. It was respectful.
Yeah. It also feels like, I think Joe Johnston and yourself maybe have sort of talked about ILM as being this kind of film school almost. And it feels like for Jedi, like he was bumping you up, you were reaching this point of graduation. Now you got to take even more responsibility on. So for Jedi, you were heading up the creature shop. Nilo was suddenly goes from an industrial designer to a costume designer, which, kind of freaked him out at the time. Did you ever feel the kind of the pressure of moving up and overseeing everything, or was it just something that felt like a natural progression for you?
Well, I didn't have a choice. I tried to talk him into hiring Rick Baker and Rob Bottin, but again,
right.
I think George, did cast us for personality types, and though both of those guys were kind of monolithic in how they approached things. I was a stop motion animator. But, we'd worked on the cantina scene, so I understood the processes and how to build and design and, fabricate and all that. And so I was just appointed, it was like, Phil's doing this. I was going to co-do it with Chris Wallace, but he bailed to do The Fly. And I think that was just as well. It worked out that way because we didn't really need two voices. But it was, a challenge for me in that, I had to, instead of having this one thing that I could just orbit around, now it was like with a big crew of people and figuring out flow charts and, it was, pretty involved.
Yeah, and being out on set as well. Like I remember seeing shots of you in Yuma, Arizona, just blowing some cold air down the mouth of an alien mask or something, So you were there supervising all of that stuff as well, as opposed to being in your dark studio, animating away. That must have felt quite different.
Going on location is just, what it is. So, I mean, I've been on, we did Piranha and I forget, Crater Lake Monster, some, lower budget, things where I've been on location and, did a lot of TV commercials. So I was pretty well versed in terms of how, everything worked in location shooting, or it is in production in general.
Yeah, but maybe surprised at the size of that set at the time. I mean, that was huge, that thing, wasn't it? They built out there in Yuma, the sail barge.
Yeah, it was crazy. In that, when they first got there, George had, or the who was it, Norman Reynolds, had all of the shrubbery picked off all the sandy dunes to make it look like a planet, which took away all of the shade for all the vermin that lived around there.
Right.
So the only shade was the area beneath the barge. So when we were working there, we had to be really careful and use like brooms to turn over, boxes to make sure there weren't tarantulas or scorpions, rattlesnakes there. And there were.
Jeez. That's like when they picked all the aerials off of the rooftops in Tunisia for that shot in Raiders as well. You just think the lengths at which these productions had to go to pre-CG to kind of make sure the extremities of the shot were free of any unwanted things. Yeah, I saw a photo some years ago of that set. I think it was a guy who turned up on a quad bike or something and took a bunch of snaps. And one of them shows all the speeder bikes lined up next to the sail barge. Now, I assume that's because that production was due to go on up to the Redwoods in California for the Ewok stuff, for the Moon of Endor. Do you know why those speeder bikes were there? And then did you end up going up to the Redwoods as well?
I never saw the speeder bikes there. It doesn't make any sense that they would send them to Yuma. And then, but then, I went up to, shooting the Ewoks up in the Pacific West.
Was there much articulation in those faces back then? Because I think there was a few experiments, wasn't there, with Stuart Freeborn's work and presumably you overseeing it as well, with blinks and kind of articulation in the mouth a bit.
Yeah, we tried, both Stuart and I tried blinks, but, they weren't that successful. So, and there wasn't a whole lot you could do with those faces. We were kind of like, most of us there were like, really, Ewoks. Yeah. So
I think that's where Star Wars changed for a lot of people. But you talk about the sort of experimentation there as well, and I always think of, that original documentary about Return of the Jedi, Star Wars to Jedi. I always think of that stuff of you in the Rancor, the Godzilla suit kind of thing, experimenting to see if it would work, and just going, actually that doesn't work. And then Dennis saying, let's go and do a rod puppet. It still seems that even though it's a massive budget movie, all that expectation on that movie, and George piling in tons of money each time he made one of these, that you still had that kind of flexibility in there. Was the time frame tight on that movie, or did you feel like you had the space to do that kind of stuff?
Well, it just didn't work. So,
so you had to find a solution. Yeah.
We were dubious about that, to begin with, because the thing I designed was, for a stop motion puppet. So, fitting a guy in it was like, and the action that it had to do was, it could have been figured out, I suppose, but not with the time that we had. So, we were, going to act preemptively, Dennis and I, and had Tom Santamon build an armature. We were going to do it as dual motion, but we just ran out of time. So Dennis proposed we do it as a high-speed puppet, and that's what we did.
Yeah. I love that story you told my a friend of mine, Alexandra Poncet, when you did the documentary about you, about how you had your hand stuck up the arse of this thing because it had swollen up so much. So you had to eat your lunch with your hand up a Rancor's arse.
All through, yeah.
He's a good guy, Alex. I saw him this year, or just last year, actually.
Yeah.
Um, tho- those, I think it was on Empire, wasn't it? When you first had those kind of primitive video playback systems. I think you said Dennis had found
Wow.
that. How did that kind of change your work? What did that bring? I mean, obviously it lets you experiment and watch back without shooting on film, but is there anything else, any other advantages in that you found?
Well, that was essential when I was, going in and doing a bunch of, exercises, kind of like playing the scales on the piano, just to get beat. So getting immediate feedback was really helpful. And the production, we didn't use it that much because it was, we were always racing the lab run, and what is what you were going to get. And unless you put a beam splitter up and we're shooting through and seeing exactly what the camera was seeing, there's no point in it, because even if
Yeah.
it was off a few axes, what you're looking at is not you can't accurately judge what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah. When what I've often wondered about, like particularly on like Star Wars and Empire, did you, when you were doing like the animation of the chess pieces, or you're doing the Tauntaun or the walkers, were you getting to see the shots that it was going to be cut with? Like, did you get like dailies shown from Finzer to show you, oh, this is the master shot we've done here, and your stuff's going to be matted in here,
Yeah.
or
Wow.
were you sort of in your own bubble?
No, I mean there were animatics, that the animation Korean's animation department would put together, and they were like just really sketchy, and it was like pretty loose. I mean, there would be the background plates that were shot, and George would explain what that was. We'd watch the sequence or the scene over and over and over, and I remember had one where the walkers are supposed to be walking in, and they're very simple cell animations, but he had them leaping like deer, and it was everybody laughed, and George didn't say, oh, get serious, and left them in the whole time, until we finally did the shot. And then for what we would do were like animatics too. I think Joe and Dennis did all the choreographed the entire speeder bike chase with little figures on coat hangers, going through scenario. Well, yeah, a rehearsal too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but that's how you learn and discover, isn't it? As a kid, I mean, up until you get to like proper school, learning is done purely by play, isn't it? And then that's kind of knocked out of us as we go through the education system, and doubly so now for kids who have like iPhones in their faces.
Yeah, well, I guess when I was a kid, you could get these. They were made by a company called toy company called Marks, and you can get these things really cheaply for like $5, and you can get like dinosaurs and cavemen 1 year for Christmas. I think they cost like $5, and then you'd lose half of them during the year. And the next one, you get like the Germans and the Americans. The next year, you get Cowboys and Indians, blah, blah, blah. And so, that was like, again, I would just close my world off and create scenarios. And that was really like, the beginning of coming up with, scenarios and how this happens and that happens. And that's what these guys are doing. And that's what, so it's, Ray Harryhausen was accused of having a God complex, and there's like, you because of the nature of this kind of work, you're controlling everything,
Yeah, true.
Even when you're working with a big team of people, there's a narrow margin by which okay, this all kind of has to fit together just this way, and you can't really explain it to anybody.
Yeah, but that's what you're doing as a kid, isn't it? You're being God with those toys. That's what you're the puppet master at that point.
Yeah, and then as these things are blending, you're making up stories with the Nazis and dinosaurs. Yeah, at the end of the day, there may be some Indians as well.
Yeah, or for me, it was the Rancor monster biting Admiral Akbar's head off instead of the Gamorrean guard's head. So it's interesting how you came from that world and then you inspired, like, my generation, I guess, to do the same stuff. We were all out there in the sand pit and in the dirt and the grass, and the snow when we could, making up expanded stories in that world that, George and you guys had put on the screen. So, yeah, it's a cyclical thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Crazy.
I've seen like George in clips over the years, like where he's looking at a bunch of maquettes that you and the team have put together, and he goes, "Okay, this one could be Admiral Akbar on,
Yep.
I want Jabba to look like to Sydney
Green Street, yeah.
Green Street, yeah." But George always seems like I said before, he sort of hands it over to you to come up with some ideas, and then he picks his favorite out of those. Did you find that with working with other directors that it was similar in that way, or did those directors want you to come fully armed with a kind of final decision on something?
George just kind of wanted to see stuff,
Yeah.
and it really depended on, for the chess set, he had a specific scene in mind. Didn't really have the action worked out. That was a last minute thing. It was like, can you do this thing, in 2 weeks, before the deadline, so that, then you're just rushing to get the stuff done. And, but we certainly had more time. What was your question again?
It was just about, like, George clearly wants like a big range of options that he can pluck his favorites from. But do other directors kind of expect you, as now Phil Tippett and Tippett Studios, to come with, answers immediately rather than giving that big range?
Two things about George. One, he was footing the bill for this stuff.
Yes.
And that made a huge difference to every other production that I've been on, because he would expedite things. I would even have to, there's a shot, and it happened on a few shots, but when the Luke and the Tauntaun come up to the crest of the hill, the first take that I did was terrible in Georgia. Oh, it's okay, we'll cut it in the film. And so I had to plead with him to let me do a retake. And when he was reticent to do it, he just wanted to move on. And that never happens, particularly now in the digital age. You can find yourself doing like 500 fucking takes on something, and people actually forget what they're doing, and you just get so much help from micromanaging. That was, and the other thing that George would do, like with the chess set, we built 10 creatures and he chose 8. And then with Jedi, it was just like, once I cast kind of a wide net with sculptors and people that I had available, and every week we'd meet up, and George would look at what we had done, and then he would cast from there. He's kind of like a documentary filmmaker. So you show me the forest, and I'll decide or the zoo, and I'll shoot what I want to, and then he would name them Admiral Akbar, or whatever.
Yeah, right.
And I think was like, there was a Akbar, I don't know what it was. There was a Miwok gas station. There was an Akbar something else,
right.
Iranian, restaurant someplace,
Okay. I also wonder, like, how when you're working on Jedi, you're over in California, you got Stuart Freeborn's shop building a bunch of stuff, including, the biggest puppet ever put on film at this point, Jabba the Hutt. Were you flying to and fro, or did you just kind of pack up shop one day, ship everything over, and then arrive in London for the shoot?
Yeah, we worked independently, pretty much. I mean, completely. So,
what did you think when you arrived then, when you saw the final Jabba?
It was like a tremendous feat of engineering. I mean, it always looked like a puppet to me. It's like, but it totally worked. I mean, the stuff that George did, a lot of it was like, my thinking, some of us was like, really, this is never going to work, like, what was it? Yoda. We had only seen stills of production stills of Yoda while we're working on it, and then maybe a clip or something like that. And it wasn't until we went into like editorial to look at these scenes, and you see like the first shot of Yoda, and he's walking, and you go like, oh God, it looks like exactly what it is. And a couple shots later, you've completely forgotten it because you're into the character and what's going on. So it's there is a magic there.
Yeah, I was always amazed as a kid when I would watch something like I don't know, Movie Magic or one of those behind the scenes documentaries where you see the on-set footage and all you can hear is the noise of like, smoke being created or the noise of the camera, and you haven't got the score, you haven't got the voice, you haven't got the effects, and you've got some crappy TV camera shooting, and then you see they cut to the shot of the film, and there's this magic that happens when all of that stuff comes together, isn't there? Such a collaborative art form. But yet you've gone down the route of making your own film that's purely stop motion with Mad God, which I watched recently, and it was everything I wanted it to be. By the way, it was crazy and it was kind of freaky and scary and disgusting in all the best ways that I expected and wanted it to be. Do you find that do you find directing yourself? Obviously, you had a team with you. You had people that came into the studio to help you. But do you find that work more fulfilling than just doing like a 10 3-second shots in a Star Wars movie?
No, yeah, definitely. I mean, I went to art school in college. I was really influenced. It's just very similar to like Brian Eno and David Byrne or whoever. There's those of us that went to art school and came out with a different kind of take than our peers. The other guys that had grown up wanting to work in movies, and to work in movies, but I want to work in that perspective, from that perspective. And what was I saying? Ask the question again. What was I saying? Thinking.
Oh, yeah, about do you like kind of being your own boss, as it were, like doing your own project rather than doing these short snippets that fit into somebody else's work? Is it more satisfying?
Yeah, when I was doing all the work for all those movies, I was a craftsman, and I forget who the artist was asked what the difference between art and craft is, and his answer was, craftsman knows what they're doing and an artist does not. And so, I was like a really, skilled craftsman, but, what I always aspired to do was get in that other zone where you have a very rough feeling or idea for what you want to do. And then it was like, Picasso was asked at some point what he was looking for when he's, formulating a painting, and his answer was, I do not seek, I find. So you're always, looking all the time and judging. Is this right? Is that right? Do I like that? Is this, feeling right? Do I need to, this thing I've worked on for like 4 weeks, it's just not coming out the way I wanted it to, and then starting over, from scratch. And, that's not the kind of, you allow yourself the time it takes to do, to complete the vision it is, which is antithetical to, normal production. And it just takes time, and you just have to give it the time that it takes to get it where you want it.
Yeah, I guess because there's no ceiling in that situation. You're not going to bump your head on the ceiling there. You're not, because you're in this constant journey of discovery and experimentation, and until you find it, you don't know what it is. That's why things, I guess, like Mad God can take, decades to make, because you're trying to find the time to do it, but also find the space physically and mentally to do it, I would imagine, as well.
That was also the result of, the kind of thing that it was, and me having to work a day job, and, a number of, issues that accumulated. certainly I couldn't do it without volunteers. But I just started, after Mad God, I just was like, enough of this shit. And I really was seriously, my brain was impaired. And so I took about, 3 years off and just wrote until relatively recently. And then, I decided to go back and start another, stop motion film that I'm working on right now. And I've got, some volunteers at the studio. It's called Sentinel, and it's about a forward observer to a nuclear cannon, and begins kind of a war movie, but different Egyptian gods show up in it, and so it's got a lot of oblique, stuff, Mad God type stuff in it.
Because you were talking about doing like a sequel to Mad God at one time, weren't you? Or did I misremember that?
No, people wanted me to,
Did they? Well, that's the thing, I guess, isn't it? Because you're not in the Hollywood system when you're making a film like that. But then when it gets bought by, I think, didn't I read somewhere that it doubled its budget on theatrical release, and then like Shudder bought it, and so it's been successful in the terms of how executives measure success. So of course, a sequel is probably going to be asked for, but I'm imagining that's not your drive. Is not to make money. Of course, you're an artist. You want to make the next project. You want to do the next thing and find the next thing.
Yeah, well, there, I don't know. Mad God's an independent movie, and it it's got, the best it's ever going to get is a cult status, and its demographic is somewhat marginal, males primarily between, in their 20s to, mid 30s, and that's the audience. It's not, it's a good size audience, but it's not for everybody. So, it's a relatively small audience, and of course, we're never going to be able to pitch something like that to a studio. It's just explain the basic idea, but then the rest of it is like, I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking as well. There's very few artists like yourself that have had the kind of career that has involved that kind of open creativity, the kind of commercial success in the big kind of Star Wars, Jurassic Park, RoboCop, Starship Troopers worlds, and then it's kind of come back to that fully kind of openly creative realm. Do those awards and things mean anything to you? When you pick up an Oscar, does that mean something? I mean, at the time, I'm sure it does, but does it develop you as an artist at that point, or is it purely like a recognition thing?
Well, it's like icing on the cake,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the most meaningful thing to me about the first Oscar of the two that I got was on Return of the Jedi, and that was Howard Koch. It was like the producer, head of production at Paramount. I met on Dragon Slayer when he would come to the stages in England, and he had just come off of Airplane that was, by my buddy John Davis. And so Howard and I kind of hit it off. And then it came to the time when George, when we were up for Academy Awards, and they have three people, it was going to be Richard, Ken, and Dennis. And George said, it's time for Phil to get an Academy Award. So he and Howard politic with the Academy to, bump it up to 4. And that started this thing where, there should be more artists involved than just 3. If, it was a huge. So, that was, something that meant a lot to me.
And I get, what was that? So that would have been 83, February, I guess, 84. Or March 84. And at that point, Tippett Studios was kind of on the horizon, right, at that point?
Well, that was my intention ever since I can remember, was to somehow figure out a way where I could have my own studio with the intention of accumulating enough equipment so that I could make my own stuff. And that just took, I am very patient in that regard. I just like kind of get on something like Ugly on an Ape, and I'll just grind away at it until, I mean, here I am 70 now, and, it took me all that time to, pull all this shit together.
Hmm. Have you, like, with Tippett Studios, I can't do the maths, but however many decades you've been running it now, has there been kind of difficult moments where you felt like we're not getting enough work here, we're going to have to keep the studio open? Or has there always been enough for you to keep going? I mean, I know you've touched on other technologies, you've kept up with certain technological advances, but you've always, in a way, I don't want to say the word defaulted, but you defaulted back to kind of your traditional animation. Tippett Studios are known for that kind of visceral, kind of tangible work. Did you ever have a moments where that kind of wasn't in vogue and you felt maybe this isn't the right direction we're going?
Not really. I mean, yeah, that I always focused on the creature character stuff because that was more interesting, and it was actually, it created more of a niche, practically everybody could environments. And then when there's a technological breakthrough, all of a sudden you see like all these movies with CG oceans. And it was like, oh, okay, great. The new animation program that could do oceans, or 10,000 Charging Men. Oh, there, 1 year, Troy comes out, and a million other 1,000 Charging Men movies. So it just drives this stuff. So I
always hated those shots, like you'd see in, like you say, Troy, or like Two Towers, the Peter Jackson movie, where I just couldn't get in my head the concept of 10,000 people storming a castle from the shot that they made in the computer, because it didn't and there's a camera swooping over it, a virtual camera swooping over it. I never buy those shots. I never buy them. It just doesn't work for me. And that's why, like, recently I spoke to the guys who did the Andor TV show, the Star Wars TV show, and they always kind of start each scene, even if they're using like the volume or if they're shot on set, they always start the scene with like a moment where you see a foot on the ground, or you see a hand on a rail, or you see something like tangible within that frame. And I think that stuff, that's why your work, I've always enjoyed your work. It always feels there's something sort of, I don't know, I can reach out and touch it,
Oh, all right. Well, great. Pretty good for you.
There are certain actors whose films I will watch because I like the actor and I know their work is always going to be great, regardless of the movie they're in. I won't name any names. I also regard you as one of those actors in a way. Like, I've watched some movies where the movie isn't great, but your work always is great. I'm not saying it stands out and kind of takes me out of the movie or anything, but I always see character in your stuff, and I'm always kind of drawn to your stuff. Like, if I think of an example, Howard the Duck. It's not a great movie, but I love your work on that movie. I just think that monster is fantastic. It's full of character, maybe more so than some of the actors in that movie. But is that something you always strive for? You always feel to me like you're always putting character into your work.
Yeah, well, you kind of have to find the angle. What is the thing? So I'd work from a concept, like said before, Rancor was a cross between a potato and a bear, blah blah blah. So I always come up with like some kind of an idea in my mind what these things kind of were like.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Phil. I appreciate you giving your time today, and I appreciate your work. Like I said, I've known your name since I was like 4 or 5, and just it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Take care.
Cheers, Phil. Take care.